Taxidermy has cost me a lot of money over the years, and in some ways my life would have been much more comfortable without it, I think. But on the other hand, it's enriched my life in so many ways. I mean, I've earned a good deal of my living for many years, not from painting pictures, because I've never really been much of a wildlife painter. I paint people more than wildlife. But I've written all sorts of books on the curiosities of natural history. And I think none of those would ever have come about if it hadn't been for my deep interest in taxidermy. And even though they weren't about taxidermy, they were about extinct things, they were about rare things, unusual things, birds of paradise. I wrote a book with David Attenborough on birds of paradise. But I don't think any of those things would have come about without my lifelong obsession with taxidermy. And so although taxidermy has kept me quite a poor man, because I've blown all my money on items, it's also enriched my life in so many ways. I think that I've always been interested in long ago and far away. And, for instance, from a very early age, I was interested in birds of paradise and beautiful tropical birds. And I was interested in fossils, dinosaurs and things. That would be long ago. Obviously, the birds of paradise would be far away. Those things always caught my attention more than British things. Many people that I know of have interested themselves exclusively in British things, like British birds, British mammals. They never interested me so much. But over the years, of course, I've acquired such things because they are interesting, badgers, otters, things of that kind, and golden eagles and peregrine falcons and little garden birds. But my real interest has always been in long ago and far away. For instance, I was probably about 20 years of age, and I acquired a stuffed platypus. And I thought it was the most marvelous thing in the world. And since then, I've acquired a number more platypuses. I think I've got about 10 of them now. And I suppose if another one came up for sale tomorrow, I might very likely buy it. And it would give me 11. Why do I want 11? I don't know. But I think my interests have always kind of remained, my real interests have remained the same, and it's beautiful tropical birds. They are my favourite things, but that doesn't stop me from expanding into other areas. But I don't think I've ever really changed direction. I think I've always wanted most what I wanted in the first place. And now I've got lots of other things. I mean, for instance, just the other day, I bought a fantastic specimen of an Arctic hare that was stuffed in about 1910, I think. So that's kind of doesn't really fit in with an interest in tropical birds, but it was just so beautifully done, I couldn't resist it. So I've got many things like that don't fit in with what you might call my core interests, but my core interests have always stayed the same. As far as money's concerned, taxidermy for many years was absolutely in the doldrums. What you have to understand about antique taxidermy was the very good examples were really a rich man's game. Ordinary people could perhaps afford a squirrel in a case, or a barn owl or something, but the great big set piece Victorian cases were very, very expensive. And over the years, their value fell absolutely remarkably to virtually nothing. In the last 2-3 decades, the value of taxidermy has increased steadily, and I'd say in the last 5, 6, 7 or 8 years, it's increased remarkably. In fact, taxidermy is now very sought after by many people, and it's very fashionable with young people. And I think that's partly to do with the fact that we now know that so many things are becoming so rare that the antique examples become particularly treasured. And there is no doubt that over the last, let me say the last 10 years, investing in taxidermy has been a very good thing from the financial point of view. I've never really cared. I mean, I don't care if I'd quite like it if I could go and buy anything that I wanted for no money. So to me, the money doesn't matter. But for those people that do care about this, there is no question that taxidermy has proved a very, very good investment. Because I've always been much more interested in antique taxidermy than newer stuff. It's very important to me that things of an antique nature come to me in their actual original condition, even if their actual condition, they've deteriorated a little bit, like the painting at the back of the picture, or something has fallen down in the case. I'd much rather have a case that's been untouched than a case that's been fiddled around with, even if the fiddling around has made it look better. I mean, I might occasionally decide that something is so badly deteriorated that it might need some decorating up or fiddling around with a bit. But I'd rather do that myself than have someone else do it. And mainly I like the thing to stay in the condition in which it's come. Whatever the years have done to it, that's how I like it. That isn't necessarily a position that other people have, but it is my position. I think this thing is something I feel generally. I know that many old master paintings like Rembrandt's and things have been restored, and I think that is a terrible mistake. I know Michelangelo's painting of the Last Judgment in the Sistine Chapel, that's been messed around with, and I think horribly messed around with. The Ambassadors by Holbein in the National Gallery, that was interfered with. I don't really like that. I mean, if a painting is falling apart, or it's absolutely filthy, then I've nothing wrong with it. I've nothing against it being cleaned in some way, but I don't like restoration in general. No, that's a thing I'm very much against, and I'm against it in taxidermy as I'm against it in art. I've been buying taxidermy for all my adult life and for a few years before my adult life. And obviously, in those times, there have been things that I would have liked to have bought, but perhaps didn't have the money at the time. One thing I always remember, and I don't know why I remember it, but I was probably about 20 at the time, and I was in Blackpool. In an antique shop in Blackpool was a scarlet ibis in a large glass dome. And I remember it was something like £8 or £9, which is nothing today, but then £8, £9 took some getting, really. And I thought about this thing, and I wanted it, but I thought, oh no, I can't quite afford it. And I went back the next day and it was gone. And maybe because it was gone the next day, I've never forgotten this thing. It probably was nowhere near as good as in my imagination, I built it up to. So that was a big disappointment to me. And it's really nothing, but in my mind, it's something I would have really liked. I've sold a few things that I regret selling over the years. I sold a couple of things to my friend Sheikh Saud. In fact, there's a couple of things I really wish I hadn't sold him, but there you are. I needed the money at the time, and you have to live. But mostly I've acquired everything that I've wanted. Some things I've waited many years for. In fact, I think I mentioned at some point a family of 3 fox cubs. I knew of that case. I've known of that case for at least 30 years. And 3 or 4 years ago, I was able to get it. So rather than things that I've missed, or I think things that I've waited for are kind of more in my mind than things that I missed. Off the top of my head, the only thing I can remember really feeling bad about is that scarlet ibis. And probably if I saw it now, I probably wouldn't even particularly want it. I don't know. But at that time I did. The quality of taxidermy is obviously a very variable thing, and some of the great exponents in Victorian England and Edwardian England were really, really skilled, and many of them were just mediocre. And once you get an eye for these things, it always amazes me how easy it is to tell between a good piece of work and a poor piece of work or a mediocre piece of work. It surprises me that a lot of people can't tell that difference, but many people can. And there are certain great exponents like Roland Wald or Peter Spicer, and these people's, the cases of taxidermy that they produced are often immediately recognizable to those that have got eyes to see. Of course, most taxidermy is mediocre, just like most of anything. Most antique chairs are mediocre, most paintings are mediocre, most of everything is mediocre. But the really top quality stuff always stands out. And the more you get interested in a subject, no matter what that subject is, the more you kind of learn to tell the difference between good, indifferent, or bad. And I suppose my taste evolved with my experience and knowledge of the subject, and also the fact that I was buying so many items that you can compare and contrast very easily. If you've only got 1 or 2 items, it's much more difficult. But I had maybe, let's say, I'm 25 and I've got 30 really interesting cases and of Victorian taxidermy, because I'd have to say that Victorian and Edwardian taxidermy has always been my great interest. I'm not so interested in modern things, although there are some very, very good taxidermists out there today. But my interest has always been in the more antique items. And so I'd got, say, I'm 30 years old, let's say, and I've got 30, 40 cases. So I can compare and contrast, and I can think, oh no, this case is much better than that case, or that case isn't as good as this one. And so it always became, or it eventually became, it didn't suddenly become, it eventually became a big issue with me, the quality of the actual work. And there's 2 ways of looking at taxidermy. You can either concentrate on rare or unusual or beautiful birds or animals, or you can concentrate on the ability of the person that stuffed them. And so I've always had these 2 ideas in my mind. Both, as many people know, I've written a number of books on extinct and rare creatures. So I've always been very interested in rare things. And sometimes you'll buy a piece of taxidermy just because it's a rare thing. It's not particularly well done, but it's a very rare specimen, or maybe sometimes even an extinct specimen. But sometimes I'll buy something that's a really common thing, like a fox, say, because it's been absolutely beautifully done. I mean, I've got a case here in this house of 3 fox cubs stuffed by a man called Peter Spicer in the 1870s, and it's an absolutely magnificent piece of work. But obviously fox heads, about the most common stuffed things you could hope to get, but these ones transcend their commonness if you want to call it commonness, and become, I'm not saying it's fine art, because I don't believe taxidermy is fine art, but there is certainly an artistic level that they approach. There are many misconceptions about taxidermy, and they started some time ago when I was a child. As I keep telling people that the items of Victorian Edwardian taxidermy had no real value. It was so far out of fashion. And partly that was just simply because it was out of fashion. Partly it was because of the kind of perception that taxidermy was cruel, and that people were more interested in the preservation of animals rather than seeing them as stuffed stationary items. Perhaps some of that was because film had made the viewing of animals that something like, say, a Victorian gentleman could never have seen a herd of elephants or imagined what they looked like. But today, and since, say, the Second World War, we've had wonderful wildlife films that show animals as they really are in the wild. And I suppose that was part of the reason why taxidermy became, let's say, unpopular. But I think in the last few years, people have got over that, and they've realized that taxidermy isn't necessarily a cruel thing. That, you know, I think sometimes perhaps one of the beginnings of taxidermy was when someone might stumble across a dead bird lying in the woods or the fields, and the thing, if it's freshly dead, looks so beautiful that you want to kind of preserve that beauty. And I think probably that was one of the starting points of taxidermy, trying to make a thing look permanently as it looked in life. And this idea of the smudging of the boundaries of life and death was a very important thing to taxidermists. And I think many taxidermists in this country, current taxidermists I'm talking about now, are much more conservationally minded than the average person. I mean, I don't know anyone personally that would handle something that has been deliberately killed for the purpose of taxidermy. Many of the taxidermists that I do know are very much into basic wildlife issues. I don't know anyone that isn't. I don't know how it is in other countries. And you know, sometimes I've seen things on the television about taxidermists in the US, and I'm not sure about some of them. But talking about people in the UK, I think the majority, in fact almost all taxidermists, are very concerned with the preservation of wildlife. I don't know anyone that wouldn't have an ethical position. Obviously, over the years, taxidermy has put me into a number of interesting situations, and I've known people that haven't got two pennies to rub together, and I've also known multi-billionaires. Perhaps one of the most interesting characters I ever came across was Saud Al-Thani, who was one of the rulers of Qatar, and he had, for all intents and purposes, limitless funds. And I remember the first time I ever went to see him, as I walked into his kind of majlis room, you knew that you were stepping into something that was very close to fairyland. David Bailey was there taking his picture, and there were various attendants there doing extraordinary things, half of them speaking in Arabic, half of them speaking in English. And the very first time I met him, he asked me if I would go, this was in London, he asked me if I would go to Qatar the following Tuesday, just because for some reason he liked me, and he decided that I was going to organise an exhibition of taxidermy, fossils and natural history paintings for him. I didn't realise at the time that that's what he wanted, but that was what his idea was. And so 2 days after first meeting him, I was whisked off to Qatar I think on the Qatari Royal Jet, which was kind of an experience out of my any previous thing that I'd ever done. And for several years, he and I became very good friends, and he did a lot of business with me. He'd ask me for certain things and I'd go and find them. And he was one very interesting character. Another character that influenced me a great deal was Raymond Ching, the famous New Zealand painter. And I first met Ray when I think I was 22 or something like that. And because I'd always painted pictures and was interested in art, he was very, very interesting to me because he has such fantastic technical ability. But also, he was very, very keen on stuffed birds. He didn't used to use them in his bird paintings. He mostly had what we call cabinet skins of birds, which were just the bird stuffed flat, and so you could use it as a reference to get all the colours and the shapes of the wings, etc. So he'd lean on those rather than stuffed birds, because if you paint from stuffed birds, it often shows that it's a stuffed bird you're painting from. So he didn't really do that, but he did have a collection of stuffed birds, just not to actually use in his paintings, but to kind of fire him up to get excited about the birds. And he had some fantastic cases by Cullingford and Duncan, who were two late Victorian taxidermists that operated near Newcastle and Durham. And he had several wonderful cases that I did in fact buy off him in the end. But he was is a very interesting character that I met through taxidermy. There are things that I would like to acquire that I don't have, and the thing that would be top of that list is I have 37 of the 42 species of birds of paradise. So I'm 5 short, and I would really like those remaining 5. I somehow doubt that I'll ever get them, because some of the ones that I've already got, I've only acquired through luck or being in the right place at the right time. And I think the 5 birds of paradise that I'm missing are probably something that will always be missing, but those would be absolutely top of my list that I would want if I could get them. There are other things that I would like, but there are certain extinct birds that I would like, but they're not likely to come along either. Mostly, what's likely to come along, I've already got. So my interest might be to acquire a better example than the one I've got. But that does happen sometimes. But as I say, my top pick would be the 5 birds of paradise that I don't have.